The day had been long, and the sun still hung low in the sky, casting a tired amber hue over the streets. Jace, a seasoned officer with years of service under his belt, felt the weight of it all pressing down on his shoulders as he pushed open the door to his favorite diner. The familiar chime of the bell above the door greeted him, a small, comforting sound that signaled the start of a brief respite from the chaos of his day. Inside, the diner was a sanctuary of normalcy. The hum of quiet conversation, the clinking of silverware against plates, and the soft murmur of a distant radio created a cocoon of peace that Jace had come to rely on. He nodded at Joe, the mechanic, who was hunched over a cup of coffee at the counter, and exchanged a small wave with Betty, the ever-smiling waitress who had worked there for as long as he could remember. Jace made his way to his usual booth in the corner, the leather seat creaking softly as he settled in. He let out a deep sigh, allowing himself to relax, if only for a moment. The familiar faces around him, the steady rhythm of life within these walls, always managed to soothe the tension that his job left coiled in his muscles. As he scanned the room out of habit, his gaze landed on a small figure tucked away in the opposite corner. A little girl, no more than 5 or 6, sat beside a man who was absorbed in an intense phone conversation. The girl's big, curious eyes darted around the diner, but it wasn't the usual restless energy of a child that caught Jace's attention. It was something deeper, an unease, a quiet desperation that lingered just beneath the surface. Her eyes met his, and in that fleeting moment, Jace felt a pang of something he couldn't quite place. Concern, perhaps. A cop's instinct, honed by years of reading people, whispered that something wasn't right. The man, presumably her father, was too engrossed in his call to notice anything amiss, his voice low but clipped, every word laced with tension. Jace couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this scene than met the eye. The way the girl glanced around, as if searching for something, or someone, seemed out of place in this otherwise mundane setting. He watched her, trying to make sense of the unease gnawing at the back of his mind. As his meal arrived, Jace tried to focus on eating, but the image of the girl's worried expression lingered. Every time he looked up, she was watching him, her eyes wide, almost pleading. It was a look he had seen before on people who didn't know how to ask for help, who couldn't find the words to express their fear. Jace leaned back in his seat, the unease growing. He knew he couldn't just ignore it. Something about that little girl's eyes wouldn't let him. Jace leaned back in his booth, his eyes fixed on the small figure across the diner. The man, her father, had called her Emily. It was a name Jace had caught unintentionally when the man barked it into the phone, frustration lacing his tone. A simple name, yet the way she responded to it, her slight flinch, the nervous glance, spoke volumes. Jace softened his gaze, willing her to see that he meant no harm. He offered a small, encouraging smile, the kind that had often worked wonders in diffusing tense situations. Emily looked at him, hesitating, as if weighing the risk. Her tiny fingers fidgeted with the edge of the table, the only sign of the internal battle raging within her. Her father's voice rose in volume, his tone clipped and angry, oblivious to the world around him. Emily winced, her wide eyes locking onto Jace's. He gave her a barely perceptible nod, a silent invitation that said, "It's okay. You can trust me." She seemed to take a deep breath, summoning courage from a place Jace could only guess at, and slid off her chair. Each step she took toward him was hesitant, her small feet shuffling as if they might betray her at any moment. She paused halfway, glancing back at her father. The man's voice grew louder, but he still didn't notice her absence. Jace remained still, his gaze unwavering. He could see the fear in her eyes, but also something else. Determination. She closed the remaining distance between them, her small hands clutching the edge of his table as if it were a lifeline. "Hi, Emily," Jace said softly, his voice just above a whisper. The use of her name seemed to surprise her, but also, perhaps, comfort her. He waited, letting the silence between them stretch, giving her the space she needed to speak. Emily glanced back at her father, then back at Jace, her eyes pleading. "Please help, Mommy," she whispered so softly Jace almost missed it. "She's hurt, and Daddy says we're leaving. I'm scared." Jace felt the weight of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. His mind raced, but he kept his voice calm. "It's okay, Emily. You did the right thing coming to me." He gently pulled her closer, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "I'm going to help you, and I'll make sure your mommy is safe." Emily's lower lip quivered, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him slightly, as if testing the waters of his reassurance. Jace felt a surge of protectiveness rise within him, a fierce resolve to shield this little girl from whatever danger lurked in her life. "Where's your mommy now?" he asked, his voice steady but soft, trying not to overwhelm her with urgency. Emily's eyes welled up, but she blinked back the tears. "At home," she said, her voice trembling. "Daddy, he got really mad. Mommy tried to stop him, but he hurt her." Jace swallowed the anger that flared up in his chest, focusing instead on the trembling child before him. "You're very brave, Emily. We're going to make sure your mommy is okay." She nodded, a small, tentative movement, but Jace could see the hope starting to flicker in her eyes. He gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Stay right here with me, okay? We'll get some help, and we'll take care of everything." Emily stayed close, her trust fragile but growing. Jace knew that whatever came next, he had to be ready. The danger was real, and time was running out. But for now, keeping this little girl safe was all that mattered. As he reached for his radio, Jace silently vowed that he wouldn't let Emily down. Not now. Not ever. The diner's hum of conversation and clatter of dishes seemed to fade into the background as Jace felt Emily's small hand clutch his more tightly. He didn't need to look up to know that Greg, her father, had noticed their interaction. The shift in the air, the sudden hush that fell over their corner of the diner, was all too telling. Greg's voice, sharp and filled with irritation, cut through the quiet like a knife. "What do you think you're doing with my daughter?" Jace didn't flinch. He had dealt with men like Greg before, men who used intimidation as their first weapon. Slowly, Jace turned his gaze up to meet Greg's. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with a fury simmering just beneath the surface. His clenched jaw and the hard set of his eyes revealed a man who was used to getting his way, by force if necessary. Jace kept his expression neutral, calm, as he subtly moved Emily behind him, shielding her with his body. "Emily told me she was hungry, and it seemed like you were a bit too busy to notice," Jace replied evenly, his tone devoid of any challenge but also of any submission. Greg's eyes narrowed, suspicion and anger flickering across his face. "She's fine. You need to mind your own business." "This is my business," Jace said, his voice steady, especially when it involves a child who seems scared. Emily tightened her grip on Jace's hand, her small frame trembling behind him. Greg's gaze flicked down to where Emily was partially hidden by Jace's presence, and for a moment something akin to fear flashed in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by anger. Greg stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You don't know what you're getting into, officer. I'm telling you, let her go." Jace didn't move, his eyes locked on Greg's. He could feel the tension radiating off the man, a coiled spring ready to snap. But Jace had learned long ago that staying calm in the face of aggression was often the most effective tactic. "Before we go any further," Jace said, "I'm going to need to see some identification." Greg hesitated, his eyes darting around the diner as if searching for an escape route. The silence between them stretched taut, the air thick with unspoken threats. Jace didn't break eye contact, didn't give Greg any room to maneuver. The tension was almost palpable, a heavy weight pressing down on the small space they occupied. Finally, Greg fished his wallet out of his pocket, his movements jerky and reluctant. He pulled out his ID and tossed it onto the table with a sneer. "There. Satisfied?" Jace picked up the card, his eyes quickly scanning the details. Greg Stevens, lawyer. It figured, a man used to manipulating the system, thinking he could outmaneuver anyone who stood in his way. Jace placed the ID back on the table, keeping his gaze on Greg. "Thank you, Mr. Stevens," Jace said calmly, returning the card to the table. "Now, why don't you tell me why your daughter seems so scared?" Greg's composure wavered for just a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But then, just as quickly, it hardened again. "She's a kid. Kids get scared over nothing. This is ridiculous." Jace's hand instinctively moved to his radio, the small motion enough to alert Greg that things were about to get serious. "Maybe," Jace replied, "but I'm going to make sure she's safe, and you're going to stay right here until backup arrives." Panic flashed in Greg's eyes. He took a half step back, his body tensing as if preparing to bolt. Jace didn't wait. He thumbed the radio on his shoulder, his voice calm but commanding. "Unit 12. I need immediate assistance at Maple and 4th. Possible suspect, fleeing the scene." Before Greg could make a move, the door to the diner swung open, and 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, their presence filling the small space with a new kind of tension. Greg's eyes darted from Jace to the officers, calculating his chances. "Greg Stevens," Jace said, his voice firm. "You're not going anywhere." Greg's face twisted in anger, but he knew he was cornered. The officers moved in quickly, one on either side of him, their hands ready at their belts. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," Jace warned, his eyes never leaving Greg's. Greg hesitated for just a moment longer before his shoulders slumped in defeat. The officers moved in, cuffing him swiftly and efficiently. As they led him out of the diner, Greg shot one last venomous look at Jace. "You'll regret this," Greg spat, his voice filled with venom. Jace didn't react, his focus shifting back to Emily, who was watching the scene with wide, tear-filled eyes. He knelt beside her, his voice softening. "It's okay now, Emily. You're safe." But as he looked into her frightened eyes, Jace knew that this was only the beginning. Jace led Emily out of the diner, his hand a steadying presence on her small shoulder. The midday sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. The world outside seemed indifferent to the urgency Jace felt, but the tension in his chest was palpable. Every instinct told him they needed to move quickly. "Emily," Jace said, his voice calm but firm, "do you remember the way to your house?" The little girl nodded, her eyes wide and frightened. "It's not far," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jace gave her a reassuring nod. "We're going to get there fast, okay? Just stay close to me." They moved briskly, Jace keeping an eye on their surroundings while Emily led the way. The streets were mostly empty, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing beneath the surface. As they turned a corner, Emily pointed to a modest 2-story house a few doors down. It looked unassuming, just another house in a quiet neighborhood, but Jace knew better than to trust appearances. They reached the front door, which was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. Jace's pulse quickened and he carefully pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges cutting through the silence like a warning. "Stay behind me," Jace whispered to Emily, his tone leaving no room for argument. The living room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn, casting long, eerie shadows across the furniture. The air was thick with the scent of something metallic, something that made Jace's stomach tighten. "Mommy!" Emily's voice was a frightened whisper, and Jace could feel her small hand clutching the back of his shirt. Jace moved cautiously, his training kicking in as he scanned the room. Then he saw her, Sarah, Emily's mother, lying motionless in the middle of the room, her skin pale against the dark wooden floor. A pool of blood had formed around her, its deep crimson hue a stark contrast to the muted tones of the room. Jace's breath caught in his throat, but he forced himself to stay composed. He crossed the room in a few quick strides, dropping to his knees beside Sarah. Her breathing was shallow, barely there, and her pulse weak beneath his fingertips. She was alive, but only just. "Sarah?" Jace called softly, his voice low and urgent. Her eyelids fluttered, but she didn't respond. He could see the pain etched into her features, the struggle just to stay conscious. Emily was standing a few feet away, her eyes wide with fear, her small body trembling. "Mommy?" she whimpered, tears welling up in her eyes. "Emily? It's okay," Jace said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm going to help her. But I need you to stay calm, okay?" He reached for his radio, the cold metal a familiar comfort in his hand. "This is Officer Jace. I need an ambulance immediately at 2408 Willow Lane. Female victim, unconscious, severe bleeding. Respond quickly." The urgency in his voice was matched by the rapid response from the dispatcher. Jace stayed by Sarah's side, pressing a handkerchief to her wound in an attempt to slow the bleeding. He glanced back at Emily, who was standing frozen in shock, her eyes locked on her mother. Jace reached out, beckoning Emily to come closer. "Emily, I need you to stay with me, okay? Your mom is going to be okay, but I need you to help me." Emily hesitated, then slowly moved closer, her small hand finding Jace's. She knelt beside him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. The sound of sirens pierced the air, growing louder with each passing second. Jace stayed focused, talking softly to Sarah, encouraging her to hold on just a little longer. The moments stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, the paramedics burst through the front door, their movements quick and efficient. Jace stepped back, allowing them to take over, but his eyes never left Sarah. He could feel Emily's grip on his hand tighten as the paramedics worked to stabilize her mother. Jace knelt down to Emily's level, his voice soft but firm. "Your mum's going to be okay, Emily. These people are going to take good care of her. We'll go to the hospital together, all right?" Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face, but there was a glimmer of trust in her eyes as she looked at Jace. The paramedics lifted Sarah onto a stretcher, and as they carried her out, Jace picked Emily up, holding her close. "We're going to be right behind them," he assured her. "We'll stay with your mum, I promise." As they followed the stretcher to the waiting ambulance, Jace knew this was far from over. But for now, the most important thing was keeping Emily safe and ensuring that Sarah got the help she desperately needed. He wouldn't let them down. The sterile white walls of the hospital room felt suffocating, even to Jace, who was no stranger to such places. The antiseptic smell hung in the air, mingling with the quiet hum of machines monitoring Sarah's vital signs. She lay on the bed, her skin still pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. But beneath that weariness, there was a flicker of something else, a weight that had settled into her bones long before she had ended up here. Jace sat beside her, his presence steady and calm, the kind of calm that came from years of facing down danger. He had spent the last few days making sure Emily was safe and settled, but he knew that this moment, here with Sarah, was just as crucial. "Sarah," he began, his voice low and gentle, "I know this isn't easy, but I need to understand what happened. I need to know everything so I can keep you and Emily safe." Sarah's eyes flickered to his, a brief moment of vulnerability showing before she turned her gaze to the window where the sun was just beginning to set. The light cast a warm orange glow across the room, but it did little to chase away the shadows in her expression. For a long time, she didn't speak. Jace didn't push her. He knew better than to rush something like this. He could see the internal struggle, the way she was fighting to keep herself together, to not let the memories overwhelm her. Finally, she took a deep breath, the sound shaky and fragile. "Greg wasn't always like this," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "When we first met, he was charming, attentive, everything I thought I wanted. But it didn't take long for things to change." Jace listened intently, his gaze fixed on her, but his expression remained neutral, non-judgmental. He knew that this was her story to tell, her pain to unpack at her own pace. "He started small," Sarah continued, her hands twisting in the bedsheets, as if trying to wring out the tension. "Little things, like controlling who I could see, what I could do. It wasn't until after Emily was born that he started getting physical." The word hung in the air, heavy and bitter. Jace felt a cold anger coil in his chest, but he kept it buried deep, his focus entirely on Sarah. "He always knew how to apologize afterward," she said, her voice tinged with a mix of bitterness and resignation. "Flowers, gifts, promises it would never happen again. But it always did, and each time it got worse." Sarah paused, her eyes distant, as if she were watching a replay of all the moments she wished she could erase. "I tried to leave him once, but he found us. I thought he'd kill me that night. I should have gone to the police, but I was too scared. He said he'd take Emily away, that I'd never see her again." The fear in her voice was palpable, and Jace's heart ached for her. He knew all too well the power that fear could hold over someone, how it could trap them in a situation they knew was dangerous, but felt powerless to escape. "Sarah," Jace said softly, leaning forward slightly, "none of this is your fault. What Greg did, what he's done to you and Emily, he'll have to answer for that. But you don't have to be afraid anymore. I won't let him hurt you again." Sarah finally looked at him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I just want Emily to be safe. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure she doesn't have to live in fear like I did." "You've already taken the hardest step," Jace replied, his voice firm but reassuring. "You've gotten her out of there. Now, it's my turn to make sure he can't get to either of you again." Sarah nodded, a small tentative movement, as if she were still trying to believe that this nightmare could finally be over. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of all the fear and gratitude she couldn't fully express. Jace reached out, placing a hand gently on hers. "You're not alone in this, Sarah. We'll get through it, one step at a time." The air in the hospital room was thick with the weight of the decision Sarah had just voiced. Jace stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the world outside, but his mind firmly anchored in the room. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white with the pressure. Her decision had been made, but the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty, and they both knew it. "I'm going to do it," Sarah repeated, her voice steady but quiet. "I'm going to file charges against Greg." Jace turned to face her, nodding slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. "It's the right move, Sarah, but it's not going to be easy. He's going to fight back." Sarah's eyes met his, a flicker of determination in them that Jace hadn't seen before. I know, but I'm done being afraid. Emily deserves better. I deserve better. Jace crossed the room and sat down in the chair beside her bed, leaning forward slightly. We'll need to be thorough. Every detail, every piece of evidence, it all needs to be airtight. Greg's not just going to roll over and accept this. He's going to use every trick he knows to try and make this go away. Sarah nodded, absorbing his words, the gravity of what she was about to embark on settling over her like a heavy cloak. Where do we start? First, we'll gather everything we can, texts, emails, any records of his threats or violence. We'll document every bruise, every injury, and get statements from anyone who's witnessed his behavior. It's going to be a lot, but we'll take it one step at a time. Jace's voice was calm, methodical, the voice of someone who had navigated these waters before. But there was something more in his tone, something that told Sarah this wasn't just another case for him. He was in this with her, not just as a protector, but as a partner in this fight. "What about Emily?" Sarah asked, her voice faltering slightly. The thought of her daughter being dragged into a courtroom, of having to relive the trauma, was almost too much to bear. "We'll do everything we can to protect her," Jace assured her. "Her testimony might be necessary, but only if absolutely needed. Our priority is keeping her safe, both physically and emotionally." Sarah nodded again, her eyes focused on a point just beyond Jace, as if she were seeing the future unfold before her. "I never thought I'd be here," she admitted, her voice tinged with a mix of regret and resolve. "I never thought I'd have to fight like this, just to keep my daughter safe." Jace leaned back in his chair, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "No one should have to, but you're doing the right thing. You're standing up for yourself, and for Emily. That takes a lot of strength." For a moment the room was silent, the weight of their conversation pressing down on them both. But then Sarah straightened, a new resolve hardening her features. "Let's do it, Jace. Let's bring him to justice." A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of Jace's mouth. "He will," he said firmly. "We'll take it one step at a time, and we'll get through this." Over the next few days, they worked together, their bond strengthening with each shared task. Jace was meticulous, guiding Sarah through the legal maze, helping her piece together the shattered fragments of her life into a coherent, undeniable narrative of abuse and control. He was patient, never pushing her too hard, but always encouraging her to keep going, to stay strong. Late nights were spent going over documents, reviewing the evidence and preparing for the inevitable confrontation with Greg's legal team. Jace was a constant presence, a steady hand on the tiller as they navigated the rough seas ahead. And as they worked side by side, something unspoken began to build between them, a mutual respect, a shared determination that went beyond the legal battle. It was a connection forged in the fire of their shared struggle, a bond that grew stronger with each passing day. By the time the preparations were complete, Sarah was no longer the frightened woman Jace had first met. She was still scarred, still healing, but she was also stronger, more resolute. And with Jace by her side, she knew she could face whatever came next. "We're ready," Jace said one evening, as they finished reviewing the last of the documents. "Greg doesn't stand a chance." Sarah looked at him, gratitude and something deeper shining in her eyes. "Thank you, Jace. I couldn't have done this without you." "You're stronger than you think, Sarah," Jace replied, his voice warm but firm. "But I'm glad I could help, and I'm not going anywhere. We're in this together." As they prepared to face the battle ahead, they both knew that the road would be long and difficult. But they also knew that together they were strong enough to see it through to the end. The courtroom was a stark, almost sterile place, where every whisper seemed amplified by the tension that hung in the air. Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table, her back straight, hands folded tightly in her lap. Beside her, Jace was a calm and steady presence, his gaze fixed on the proceedings, ready to step in whenever needed. Across the room, Greg sat with his lawyer, his expression a mixture of defiance and calculated indifference. He had dressed sharply for the occasion, trying to project an image of control, of a man wronged by a vindictive ex-wife. But the facade didn't fool Jace. He could see the nervous energy beneath the surface, the way Greg's fingers drummed lightly on the table, the slight twitch in his jaw. The judge called the court to order, and the proceedings began with the methodical presentation of evidence. Sarah's attorney laid out the case with precision, painting a clear picture of the years of abuse, the escalating violence, the threats that had loomed over her and Emily like a dark cloud. Greg's lawyer, a man seasoned in the art of deflection and doubt, wasted no time in attacking Sarah's credibility. He questioned her motives, implying that her accusations were driven by a desire for revenge, a way to punish Greg for leaving her. He suggested that her injuries were exaggerated, that her accounts were unreliable. Sarah sat quietly through the onslaught, her face pale but resolute. Jace, watching from beside her, felt the anger rise in his chest, but he knew this was part of the game, an ugly, necessary part of the battle they had to fight. When it was Sarah's turn to testify, the courtroom fell silent. She walked to the stand, her step steady but deliberate, and took her place under the judge's watchful eye. As she recounted her experiences, her voice was calm, controlled, but there was no mistaking the pain that lay just beneath the surface. "I stayed because I was scared," Sarah admitted, her voice steady despite the tremor of emotion. "I was scared for my life and for my daughter's life. He told me no one would believe me, that if I left, I'd never see Emily again. I felt trapped." Greg's lawyer attempted to discredit her, to paint her as an unreliable narrator of her own life. But Sarah didn't waver. She met every question with quiet strength, refusing to let Greg's tactics shake her resolve. Jace testified as well, offering his observations, his experience as an officer, and the evidence he had gathered. He spoke, he saw Emily, the fear in her eyes at the diner, the way she clung to him as if he were her last lifeline. He described Sarah's injuries, the medical records that corroborated her story, and the pattern of control and violence that was all too familiar to him from his years on the force. The defense tried to poke holes in his testimony, but Jace was unwavering. He had seen too many cases like this, had learned to anticipate every move a man like Greg would make. He was prepared for every question, every attempt to twist the truth. As the trial wore on, it became clear that the evidence was stacked against Greg. His attempts to manipulate the narrative, to cast himself as the victim, fell flat in the face of the overwhelming proof of his guilt. The photographs, the medical records, the testimonies, they all painted a damning picture that even the most skilled defense attorney couldn't fully dismantle. Finally, the moment came when the judge, after hours of deliberation, delivered the verdict. The courtroom held its breath as the words echoed through the room. Guilty of domestic abuse. Greg's face blanched, the mask of indifference slipping as the reality of his situation sank in. For a moment, he looked lost, as if the walls were closing in on him. But it was too late. The justice system had caught up with him, and there was no escaping it now. Sarah exhaled, a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, and a tear slipped down her cheek, not of sadness, but of relief. Jace placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent gesture of support, of solidarity. They had fought this battle together, and they had won. As the courtroom began to empty, Jace turned to Sarah, his voice soft but firm. "It's over, Sarah. He can't hurt you or Emily anymore." Sarah nodded, the weight of years of fear and pain slowly beginning to lift. "Thank you, Jace, for everything." He gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You're safe now, both of you." And as they walked out of the courtroom together, the first rays of hope began to pierce through the darkness that had shrouded Sarah's life for so long. The days after the trial passed in a slow, steady rhythm, a welcome change from the chaos that had once defined Sarah's life. The sharp edges of fear had dulled, replaced by a cautious hope that grew with each passing day. For the first time in what felt like years, Sarah could breathe, without the weight of dread pressing down on her chest. Emily had begun to smile again, a small but significant victory in the wake of everything they had endured. The little girl spent her afternoons playing in the park near their new home, her laughter echoing through the trees as she swung higher and higher, each arc of the swing taking her further from the memories she was slowly leaving behind. Jace was a constant presence, his role in their lives evolving from protector to something more intimate, more connected. He visited often, always finding some small excuse, a book he thought Emily might like, or a dish he wanted Sarah to try. But beneath these simple gestures was a deeper truth. He cared about them deeply, and the bond they had forged during those dark days was not something he could easily walk away from. One late afternoon, Jace arrived with groceries, offering to make dinner. Sarah, who had been sorting through old photographs, greeted him with a warm smile. "You're spoiling us," she said, a teasing lilt in her voice. Jace shrugged, setting the bags on the kitchen counter. "I like cooking," he replied simply, though they both knew there was more to it than that. He found comfort in these small acts of normalcy, in the quiet routine they were building together. As he prepared the meal, the house filled with the rich, savory aroma of simmering sauce and fresh herbs. Emily wandered into the kitchen, drawn by the smells, and Jace handed her a wooden spoon, encouraging her to stir the pot. "You're quite the chef," he remarked, watching as she carefully moved the spoon in slow circles. Emily grinned, her earlier shyness around Jace long since dissolved. "Mommy says you're the best cook she knows." Sarah, overhearing this, laughed softly. "I might have said that," she admitted, her tone light but her eyes reflecting a warmth that hadn't been there before. As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed easily, punctuated by Emily's giggles and Jace's stories of his work. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost familial, and Sarah found herself leaning into it, allowing herself to enjoy the moment without reservation. After dinner, with Emily tucked into bed, Sarah and Jace sat on the porch, the evening air cool and crisp. The stars were beginning to dot the sky, their light soft and steady against the darkness. "You've done so much for us, Jace," Sarah said quietly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't know how to thank you." Jace turned to her, his expression serious but gentle. "You don't have to thank me, Sarah. I did what anyone would do." Sarah shook her head. "Not everyone would have stayed. Not everyone would have cared as much as you did." For a moment, Jace was silent, his thoughts turning over the events that had led them to this point. The days had a new rhythm now, a quiet cadence of normalcy that Sarah had once feared she might never find again. The sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow over the breakfast table where Emily sat, her focus entirely on a picture she was drawing. The crayon moved with deliberate care, her brow furrowed in concentration, a sight that made Sarah's heart swell with a mixture of pride and relief. The house was peaceful, filled with the soft sounds of morning, the clinking of dishes, the rustling of paper, the occasional hum of the kettle boiling on the stove. It was a far cry from the tension and fear that had once dominated their lives. Now there was space for laughter, for small joys, for the simple pleasure of watching Emily grow in an environment free from the shadows of the past. Jace had become a fixture in this new life, his presence as steady and reliable as the dawn. He had taken on the role of a friend, a guardian, and something more, a piece of the family that Sarah and Emily were slowly rebuilding from the rubble of what had been. His visits were frequent, always bringing with him a sense of calm and safety that Sarah had come to cherish. This morning was no different. Jace arrived with a knock on the door and a familiar grin, holding a bouquet of wildflowers that he handed to Sarah. "Thought these might brighten up the place," he said, his voice warm and easy. Sarah took the flowers, her smile genuine. "You're too kind, Jace. But you know you don't need to bring anything. Your company's enough." "Can't help myself," Jace replied with a shrug, his eyes sparkling with a hint of mischief. "Besides, they remind me of you two, strong, resilient, and a little wild." Sarah laughed, a sound that felt so much more natural now, devoid of the strain it had once carried. "You've always had a way with words." Jace's gaze softened as he looked at her, then at Emily, who had paused her drawing to greet him with a bright smile. "Hey there, Emily," he said, walking over to see her work. "What's this masterpiece you're working on?" "It's us," Emily replied matter-of-factly, pointing to the figures on the paper. "Mommy, me, and you." Jace studied the drawing, his heart tugging at the sight of the three stick figures standing together under a big, bright sun. "I'd say you captured us pretty well," he said, ruffling Emily's hair affectionately. As they settled into the morning, sharing stories over coffee and toast, there was a sense of contentment that filled the room, a quiet assurance that they had all found their place. The fears that once loomed large had been pushed back, replaced by the steady comfort of each other's presence. After breakfast, as they lingered in the kitchen, Jace turned to Emily, his tone shifting to something more serious, but still gentle. "Emily," he began, "I've been meaning to tell you something." Emily looked up at him, her eyes curious. "You've been really brave, you know that?" Jace continued, his voice steady. "What you did, standing up, telling the truth, even when it was scary, that took a lot of courage. I'm proud of you. Your mum is too." Emily's cheeks flushed with a mix of pride and shyness, and she nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "And because of that courage," Jace added, glancing at Sarah before returning his gaze to Emily, "you and your mum are safe now. Greg can't hurt you anymore." Sarah reached over and took Emily's hand, squeezing it gently. "He's right, sweetheart. We're safe, and we have a future to look forward to. Together." Jace watched the exchange, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. This was what he had fought for, what they had all fought for. A chance at peace, at a life free from fear. As the morning stretched on, the three of them eventually made their way outside, the world bright and full of possibility. They stood together in the sunlight, a small family forged in the fires of adversity, but now standing in the light of a new beginning. And that's the powerful story of how a single act of courage can change a life forever. As we've seen, standing up against injustice, even when it seems daunting, can bring about the justice and safety that so many desperately need. Remember, sometimes it only takes one person to step up, to make that first move, to alter the course of someone's life for the better. So, next time you see someone in need, think about the difference you could make. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content that highlights the strength and resilience of the human spirit. Let's continue to spread positivity and encourage each other to be the change we want to see in the world. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.